Allie Horowitz. I am the Racing Curriculum Editor for the Michigan Journal of Race and Law. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Also, we are recording this event to put up on our website. I hope that's okay with everybody. And again, thank you all for coming. I'm going to briefly introduce Professor Crichton, and then she will take it away. Professor Shoshana Crichton teaches legal writing and is the director of the Legal Writing Center at Howard University School of Law. She is also a 1999 graduate of Howard University School of Law. Professor Crichton is the recipient of the 13th Global Legal Skills Conference Award for her commitment to the promotion of global legal skills education and for advancing diversity and inclusion in legal education around the world. She's also the recipient of Howard Law School's Warren S. Rosmarin Award for Excellence in Teaching and Service. She was named African Leadership Magazine's 100 Outstanding Leaders for 2015 as well. Professor Crichton directs the legal writing program and oversees a Master of Laws program for international students from Latin America, Canada, and the Caribbean. Professor Crichton has contributed articles to Howard Law Journal and other scholarly publications. Her article, Justice Delayed is Justice Denied, Jamaica's Duty to Deliver Timely Reserved Judgments and Written Reasons for Judgment, was published in the Syracuse Journal of International Law and Commerce and was ranked number 8 on SSRN's top 10 most downloaded papers in 2017 under the topic AARN Latin America and South America, and was cited by the Court of Appeals of Jamaica. Professor Crichton has also served as the chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee of the Legal Writing Institute from 2016 to 2018. She is also fluent in Spanish and proficient in French. And as you all know, or may know, her upcoming article in the Michigan Journal of Race and Law is titled Incorporating Social Justice in the 1L Legal Writing Course, a tool for empowering students of color and of historically marginalized groups and improving learning. And we're thrilled and very lucky to have her here to discuss her article. So, Professor Crichton.
Well, first I want to say thank you so very much for having me here. You do have a beautiful campus. I want to say thanks, just a whole lot of thanks to the editors of the Race and Law Journal, Cleo, Ali, Tom, who picked me up yesterday, Kara, we're going to talk to later. They've done such a phenomenal job on the paper, and I'm really, really, really grateful. All right, so we're going to talk a bit about incorporating social justice into the legal writing curriculum and how it benefits students, and especially students of color and of a historically marginalized group, and how it helps them to learn. We'll start by talking about the law students in stress. Then we'll talk about the brain on stress, and then we'll talk about incorporating social justice into the curriculum. All right, so law school on stress, and we know that stress starts in the brain, right? So, law students exhibit a high level of anxiety, making them the most anxious of all graduate students. So we're talking about engineering students, we're talking about medical students, we're talking about business students. Law students are the most stressed. Why are they stressed? You've got the culture of individualism. It's just me, I've got to work by myself so I can get all the grades to get the high rank, so I can get on journal, so I can get a clerkship. The Socratic method, which is kind of which is really new to the students and very frightening, you know. Professor cold calling you, and you're like, oh my goodness, am I prepared? Do I know what I'm talking about? My colleagues are looking at me. Are they going to think I'm like goofy or something? The lack of feedback from your professors, you don't know, you don't understand. As a matter of fact, it's probably in your legal writing practice course that you get the most feedback. The grades in the class is based on a final exam, so you're just thinking, oh my goodness, that last exam at the end of the year. The pressure of a heavy workload, and it often leads to social exclusion then, or social isolation. You're worried about law school related debt, you're worried about getting a job or finding a job after graduation, and of course some personality traits, some folks are just prone to worrying. And there's also the stress of daily living. We're talking about misplacing our car keys. We're talking about an inclusive medical test. We're talking about the declining health conditions of some of the people you love, your finances, the current social and political climate, and we hear all about it on the news. And the uncertainty regarding the future, the accessibility of health care. We have shooting in schools, police shooting of people of color. All of this just bombard us all the time. And for law students, we're tethered to our phones. We're streaming the news, everything on social media. So we're just getting kind of an influx of this information that really just scares us, right? Law students responding to a survey actually said that in the first year of their law school was the most stressful of their law school tenure. So they're coming in and they're really scared because all of this is all new to them. They've just left home, they haven't made friends, it's all, they feel so isolated. And the first year law students comprise the largest group of law students to indicate that stress negatively impacted their law school performance. So in other words, law students are really stressed. Now, when you think about another demographic, you're thinking about law students of color and of a historically marginalized group, and they're exposed to an additional layer of stress. So can you imagine, here is a jar that's filled with water, and then you're pouring in yet some more water on top, right? So they have just that additional layer of stress, and that's discrimination in all its iterations, right? What does it look like? You have stereotypes, threats. The stereotypes that we ascribe to persons of a particular race, color, ethnicity, sexual orientation, the perceived discrimination, the fact that they're thinking, oh my goodness, folks are thinking about me this way, and we'll get to where they get that from. The othering, this term of exclusion, we're just excluding you because you don't belong. And we'll talk about the forms that othering takes and just general social exclusions. Like, you don't belong in the store, actually you can't use this bathroom, so I'm going to call the cops on you. Or you can't use this park, so I'm going to call the cops on you. Or you know what, your child should not be here, so we're going to just take them out and leave them on the street. All right, sorry about that. What does it look like? Walking into a store, getting the evil eye, being followed or worse, they call the police on you to remove you from the store. And it happens all the time. A lot of it you hear in the news. Sometimes a lot of it's not reported. Being told, I don't understand your accent. Now here is, if it's used for I really don't understand it, it's one thing. But I took this from when I was in practice, and I had opposing counsel say to me, I don't understand your accent. And I said, oh, that's really great. I'm happy that you mentioned it, because I sat here, I didn't understand yours, but I was too polite to make it to comment. And that was the end of that. There's all X, R, so you're boxed, you're stereotyped, right? You're not looking at who you are as an individual, you're just boxed. They don't know anything about you, but you're boxed. You shouldn't even try to get on journal. Actually, you won't get on. Or, because folks like you don't. Like, what's the folks like you? Or, I can't believe you would want to apply for a clerkship. The othering, that's othering. And this came from a friend of mine who just shared this with me recently. Oh my goodness, could you clean up the spill over there? The children may fall when they come back in, assuming that she was a janitor. Actually, she's a parent. Her kids go to that school. One of the things that we also have to be aware of too, and this is just something that I'd share with you, this is the next it's a study where 6 departments looked and rated a memorandum on a scale of 1 to 10, right? And they were told that half of these people, they were given a name, and it's Thomas Meyer, and half were told that Thomas Meyer was Caucasian, and the other half was told that he was African American. The memorandum had 22 errors, 7 minor spelling errors, 6 substantive technical writing errors, 5 factual errors, and 2 analytical errors. The Caucasian Thomas Meyer received a rating of 4.1 out of 5. Favorable comments such as, and look at the comments actually, because they are objective comments, comments that you can actually use, and you can actually they said it's generally a good writing but needs to work on. So these are specific, tangible, concrete comments, right? Has the potential, good analytical skills, you know where you're going. Look at the African American Thumb Smile. He received a 3.2, remember this is the same memorandum, out of 5. And the negative comments such as, needs a lot of work, what does that mean? Can't believe he went to NYU. Oh my goodness, that's not even attacking the work, that's attacking the person. Average at best. Same work, same name, just different race. All right, so where do you find all of this? In your environment. It's on the news, it's in social media, in the supermarket, the restaurants, coffee shops, airports, on the train, in the clothing store, department stores, and I've had it so many times in the department stores, it's funny. It becomes a joke. Malls, government offices, hotels, in the workplace, in schools, in law schools, in your classes, and even in the cases that you read. And so at some point you're about to say enough now, right? And what drives this a lot? It's the media. Look at the television, and I just pulled this. You look at the television, and they're talking about it represents the representations of immigrant characters committing an unlawful act. And so this is how they stereotype us. For example, Latino, 50% criminals on television. Blacks, 30%. Middle Eastern, 25%. And whites, 9%. So when you think of us and the biases that we carry, and because we're so inundated all the time with media, this is what we think about people. And then we also have unconscious biases, largely streamed by this. I mean, if you're looking at this all the time, if you're looking at television, and the media actually tells you who you are, and actually largely tells you who you can become. And so if this is what you're looking at, this is actually the frame with which you picture other people. Half the time we don't take the time to know other persons, even if we study with them, right? We go by this lens. Okay, so it causes a lot of stress. And we're going to talk about what stress does to the brain. But before that, we'll talk about how the brain learns. And so neuroscientists, educators, and cognitive scientists have concluded that emotions are critical to learning, right? So positive emotions enhance learning, while negative emotions such as fear and anxiety can cause stress, which inhibits learning. And when you think about having to live up to a particular stereotype, it causes anxiety, right? All of this, is somebody going to think that you're constantly anxious? It's almost like you're constantly just thinking about it, right? It makes you anxious. And the anxiety and the fear, they can cause stress, which inhibits learning. Okay, so the brain is made up of billions of neurons, right? And they need to be healthy to form networks. And it's by the connection, the network connection, that they communicate. And so the networks are based on our genes and also on our experiences, right? And so when you have repeated experiences, they strengthen the connection. So can you imagine if all the time you're thinking, oh my goodness, the police is this, right? And that's your experience, and those connections in your brain is strengthened. However, the converse is also true, because once we lose a connection, and once those experiences, we stop having those experiences, then we kind of lose the connections. Our brain gets the information from the stimuli in our environment, right? And it's always hardwired to look for danger. That's how we survive. That's the basis of our survival. Because if it wasn't hardwired for our survival, then, we could always just put our hands in a snake's mouth and just, oh, that's so cute. That's not how it works. So, if the brain perceives a stimuli, the brain sends the stimuli simultaneously to the cortex and to the amygdala. So, in a perfect situation, right, the information moves into storage, which is memory, first into short-term short-term memory, and then into long-term memory. And so learning happens when the brain effectively receives its information, processes information, stores the new information, connects old information to previously stored information, and is able to later efficiently receive and retrieve previously stored information. So can you imagine you're standing up there for oral argument and you're thinking, yes, oh, I remember that case. That's the brain retrieving that information. You can effectively do that when you're not stressed, right? When you're taking a test, you're like, oh yeah, let's see. Oh yeah, battery is, and you go through the elements of battery. It's that, going back and then retrieving that information. You can do that when you're not stressed, when you're not thinking about all these other things, when you're not thinking about being harassed on your way to school that morning, right? When you're not thinking about, oh my goodness, what are they going to be thinking about me? You can effectively do that when you're not stressed. Okay, so again, in a perfect situation, the brain relies on the hippocampus to transfer the information from short-term memory, stored in the prefrontal cortex, into long-term memory. And this transfer, again, is easier and more efficient if there's a high level of interest in a stimulus. So in other words, what they're saying is the things that you pay most attention to is what you remember the most, right? Now, unfortunately, sometimes we don't even get to choose what we pay attention to because remember, the brain is always there just trying to protect us, right? So if something is threatening, then we're just going to focus on that, right? We just talked about, recalling information for oral argument and for writing a document because of that transfer between the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. We also know that memory is critical to learning, right? So if the information comes in and it goes out, it's of no moment. But if the information comes in and it's stored and you can retrieve it, that's it. You're learning, right? Emotions also affect memory as well. So if we're constantly and consciously, so if you are going to store something in what we call conscious memory, right, then you've got to attend to it. So like factual information, to remember factual information, you've got to pay attention to it, right? Emotional memory, not so much. Because you have the other storage system, which is the amygdala, that unconsciously forms and stores new emotional memory. And that part is the part that really it processes all the threat and really just keeps you on your toes to make sure that you're safe, right? So can you imagine if it's actually storing all of that and all that's going into your brain unconsciously, right? And we'll talk about what it does. We also know that strong emotional content, we remember that for a longer period of time. So think about something that really horrible that just happened to you. Somebody just said, oh, you can't come in here because you don't belong here, right? And that really hurt you. You're going to remember that for so much longer than that, the elements for torts or for battery or assault, right? Okay, so in the not so perfect world though, right, the brain still perceives the stimulus, and if it's a threatening stimulus, and of course discrimination in any of its iteration, the brain sends the message, as it does, simultaneously to the cortex and to the amygdala. But the bad news is that it actually always just gets to the amygdala first, again because of our survival. Biology is just like that, right? And then the amygdala just goes into high gear. And because it wants to protect you, right? So it floods the body with stress hormones. And this is what we tend to feel. You get headache. You're anxious, you're scared, you go into overdrive, right? So in other words, what that does, it activates the body's stress response. So you go into the fight, the or the freeze mode, right? In other words, so sometimes have you been in a situation where, you heard some bad news or something and you just stopped because you can do nothing else? Or you saw a dog running down the street and you just stopped because you just froze? Well, it's the body's stress response going into gear. But not all stress is bad, because intrinsic stress can be a motivator. So when your professor's passing on the test and you're like, it sharpens you because you're ready, right? So stress. And if we see, a lion coming or something, or a snake, and we get up to run, right? Again, that's not all bad, but stress is never meant to be long-term. It's meant to be a short-term coping mechanism, right? And so, when you have, for example, discrimination in all its iterations, it keeps you anxious for all that long time. You're constantly anxious, you're constantly on high alert. It just causes chronic stress. And chronic stress, again, remember we talked about the amygdala that really produces stress hormones? Well, it causes the neurons in the amygdala to increase, right? The converse is the neurons in the hippocampus and the cortex, which actually, helps with our higher thinking, it causes them to shrink and to die. So in other words, elevated levels of stress hormones can cause them to shut down the cortex's ability to process information, which actually hinders learning and can prevent the cortex from regulating the body's stress response, which keeps the body in a constant state of high alert and generates increased anxiety. So that just keeps you, it's like you're a hamster on that treadmill. You're just constantly stressed, right? And so damages to the dendroid or the neurons in the prefrontal cortex disrupts working memory, right? It diminishes your ability to focus. You can't reason, problem solve, think and respond accurately, prioritize, perform critical analysis. So think about this. Think about somebody just said something really upsetting to you and you're really stressed and you've got to take a test. Can you perform? No, at least not optimally, right? And the damage to the hippocampus as well affects new memory formation and recall. And if you think about memory being integral or essential to learning, then again, the process has just been hindered, right? So, chronic stress also diminishes the brain's ability to focus on factual information and stymies interest and the motivation to learn. So that's why, you're sitting and, you just heard, somebody says, really, you shouldn't really apply for that clerkship. People like you don't apply for a clerkship, and you feel really hurt. You're stressed, and you've been dealing with this all along. By the time, as a matter of fact, this is just a component, because this morning when you went to the coffee shop, you really felt slighted. They treated you in the coffee shop, and to hear this, and to think about yesterday, what happened with all of this, then, in other words, you just end up feeling blue. You cannot focus on anything for that day. All right, so there are lots of studies now that really show that chronic stress contributes to the achievement gap. So in other words, it creates an unlevel playing field in learning, right? And then, when you look at law students of color and historically marginalized groups actually, who are fearful and anxious because they're targets of discrimination inside and outside the classroom, and because of an immutable trait, their race, it's hard, they just can't learn. They cannot learn successfully, and they're at a risk of stress plus. And stress plus is just that additional layer of stress, right? Because of a trait that, because of a diversity factor of who you are, your race, your ethnicity, your sexual orientation, your gender. And so there is the situation where two people who look alike, who look very much alike actually, can undergo the same perceived threat and react differently. And why? It's because the act of internalizing that stress and the perception of control over the stressor, right? And there are many studies. There's a physician, there's this research scientist at the University of Maryland that talked about how internalizing stress has caused diminished health and caused African American men to have a shorter lifespan because they internalize the stress. Right? So we'll talk about perceived control. Perceived control is how you think you can control a particular situation and how do we get there, right? So let's talk about healing the brain on stress, and we think about how do we heal, how do we just be not so stressed. And the brain can heal itself actually. So when we talk about, the hippocampus and the cortex and, the whole memory formation because you are so stressed you can't form new memories, well actually the brain can heal. And this is called neurogenesis, which allows the brain to create new neurons, and neuroplasticity, which causes different networks. And we talked about, just creating the different networks by your genes and by the information you receive, and also positive emotions as well, right? We'll talk about positive emotions, or when the threatening situation ceases, right? And we think there's no longer this whole threat, the threat is not present, or you can change your outlook, again, which comes with neuroplasticity and your perception of control, right? We also know that learning, so when you think about it, they're all interrelated. Because if you learn, it increases neuroplasticity and neurogenesis, but at the same point in time, neurogenesis and neuroplasticity contribute to learning. So if you're really totally stressed and all of this cannot go on, then you're not learning, and if you're not learning, you're just not learning because you don't have any of this, you can't heal, and the brain doesn't heal. All right, so one of the reasons we incorporate social justice into the curriculum, right, is because law students feel empowered when they work on real-life social justice issues early in their law school career because they're in confidence that they can use their legal reasoning and writing skills to help real people and to influence social change, and that builds positive emotions. The students feel that they have more control over their environment and are better able to handle psychosocial stressors, discrimination included, that cause fear and anxiety and that impair their learning. Now, incorporating social justice has the benefit, and it helps all students to learn, right? Because now, student who, when we talk about producing, and the ABNL requires us also to train culturally competent students. So it allows you to really learn about what other people, how other people live, how to treat other clients, people who do not look like you, right? And it introduces you to their situation if you're unfamiliar with it. And so it builds interest, and there are lots of students who are here because they want to go into public interest. So it feeds that interest, it motivates students of color and other interested students to learn. It gives students of color and of a historically marginalized group a voice. This is something that they're familiar with. This is something that affects people that look like them. And actually, they can actually talk about it, and they can actually see how the law works. They can also think about novel ways to change the law. And they also think about how can they help other people by putting the law into practice. And it also reduces that tendency to stereotype. Because now we know, and now we're more familiar with. And as we've said before, students are motivated when they see how they can change and they can help real people and they can affect real change. And when they're interested in a topic that's familiar to them. So remember we talked about interest driving attention, right? So this actually here, when we put into our curriculum something that's of interest to them. There's also a scenario there's a group where two students at a particular law school, and they were working on a social justice issue. And the student of color said that was the best grade that she got, but the white student was not so interested, and they were study partners, right? And so this is why we also tend to we have to balance our curriculum as well. So if that's the best grade that she got, if you had excluded it, she probably would not have been motivated to do anything, right? This was not the best grade for the white student. However, I'm sure he learned something from that as well, right? So when we're thinking about it, we don't want to just exclude, or we just don't want to put just be, we want to have some balance in it, right? Because we've got to think about all the students that we teach, right? And so for the teachers, you want to start with just one social justice assignment, one tiny issue. It doesn't have to be huge, just one tiny issue, right? At least you're motivating that part of the class. And again, since it benefits all students, then we're getting participation from everybody, right? It does not have to be an entire legal writing course, but it's just important that you start. And for the teachers, we can talk about designing the problem. This year we have an immigration problem. And when we design problems actually for our students over here, we think about what are the various stereotypes, and we try to counter the stereotypes, because stereotypes hurt, and they're not true. And so we know the perception of, we had an immigrant, for example, for the first part of our immigration problem, we had a young woman from Mexico. She's a nurse, and she came over. Her husband in Mexico is a journalist, and she came over to visit her friend, who the friend came from the United States to Mexico on a student exchange program. So they met in high school and they remained friends. So she came to visit her friend, and they were going to Disney World with the kids because their children are the same age. And she was pregnant with her second child at the time. And it so happened that they came in, she was going to be here for 2 weeks. 2 days before she returned home, her husband went on a boating vacation with his friends, and unfortunately he died. And she was so distraught, she went into premature labor, right? She's a geriatric nurse back in Mexico. She got awards, and she was hospitalized for a while. Her son, she gave birth, he was premature, and he was in the hospital for over 3 months. And the question the students had to answer is, who is the citizen, right? So in designing our problems as well, we think about, what are the concerning stereotypes, and we've got to try to dispel them, because you don't want, and for the folks designing the problems, you cannot afford to allow your students to also feel uncomfortable, because if they are under it's in the environment, what we hear from the news all the time, right? Our second part, on an immigration detainer, we have two Haitian doctors, and they were on the golf course, and the young lady came up to them and said, what are you doing here? Do you belong here? And one of the gentlemen turned around and he said, do you? And continued to play golf. And before long, the police came, and the police arrested him. And he didn't have his U.S. driver's license. His friend picked him up from the hotel. He didn't have his U.S. driver's license because he just got back from Haiti. And so he said, here's my Haitian driver's license, but I left the other one. I left my U.S. driver's license in the hotel. And the police, wanted to see his wallet. And in his wallet, he had $500. He had 2 credit cards in the name of Esther D. Brown, and her Social Security card. And the officer said, well, what do you do with those? And then ran he tried to explain that it was his sister's, but he says, no, is that what you say? Well, people like you get deported. So what did he do? What did the officer do? The officer ran the social security number. Sure enough, it was being used fraudulently, so they arrested him. They didn't even, and the police officer called ICE. Now, his friend called his brother, who was an attorney, and the brother got affidavits from the rental car company in Haiti to say, yes, the credit cards fell out in the car because, and so they gave it to him, and his sister, who was actually working in Haiti as well, sent an affidavit to say, well, that's my brother, and I had dinner with him, and my credit card and social security card fell out in the car. So of course, the police officer at the jail was really nice, and he said, okay, you're free to go, but there's this thing, there's this immigration detainer. No, they didn't even bother to tell him, or to ask him if he was a citizen. They just assumed. He was born in Boston, so they had to wait for his wife to fax over his birth certificate, which is something that they could have actually just done if they really had asked him the question. And so the students had to think about, is that an illegal seizure under the Fourth Amendment, right? So these are some of the things that we do, and in reading the cases as well. We talk about just how this affects us as students and how our students and how it affects and informs our practice, right? So that's it for me. Any questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
So one of the concerns professors like to raise about these kinds of problems is our entire class going to go off track and be distracted by these very interesting issues that maybe aren't legal, maybe don't have immediate relevance to what my students are writing? And if so, do I let my students run with it for 45 minutes? I have kind of my own answer to that, but have you gotten that question, and what's your answer to that one?
As a teacher, I think we are in control of our classroom, so they would, even if they go off on a tangent, it's our duty to stop them, because we can't say we will not raise it because students will go off on a tangent. Because again, we are expected to raise also culturally competent students. So they need to know how to navigate the territory when they go out into practice. And so we set the parameters, this is what, and then, of course they will try. This is by nature. And then sometimes you're like, and so what do you think? And if you are in that position, how would you feel? And just cause them to reflect, and sometimes you'll be surprised. Yes?
One of my biggest critiques about law school, and the first year in particular, as someone who is passionate about these issues, is the fact that anytime a professor references social justice issues, they think of it as being off track or a tangent, when race and issues tangentially related to race are inherently a part of the law and influence the way we craft and interpret the law. It's okay. Can you talk a little bit about how you can integrate those topics into the law rather than thinking of them as tangents?
Well, they're not tangential actually, because guess what happened? If you look at your cases, and you are going to be expected to read the cases, so they cover these topics, and they cover them, some of them in flattering ways, and some of them in not so very flattering ways. And so, at some point, I think we should not just think of them as other, but as a part of, because it frames and it informs how you are going to look at different policies, and how you're going to, because remember, the law is not static, it's dynamic, right? And it influences law, and then this is how we think about change, and this is how we affect change. So it's not just over there, it's all integrated.
So to follow up on that question, because like, so I'm a second year law student, and I feel like law school, the way that the classroom is run, the Socratic method, the things that we read, kind of the way that things have been taught, particularly in 1L classes, is very like deeply entrenched in like the way that legal education is taught in this country. And so, you know, I feel like those issues aren't tangential, but I do feel like sometimes I'm combating a bigger structure of the way that legal education has been taught for so long. And so what are your thoughts on how legal education has been taught, and for those of us who are, whether it's on the professor side, the student side, are advocating for us to like better incorporate those things into the classroom so we're not fighting for them as if they are teachers?
Okay, so here's one thing. Lawyers are like molasses. They're just slow to change. Law school as well. I mean, when you think of it, and I was just doing some research last year on integrating collaboration into the curriculum, and it's amazing because and this was the basis of this as well, because we were talking about how lawyers just rejected collaboration for a long time, because this is the way we did it. You know, we sat, as a matter of fact, in practices, eat what you kill, we work in silos, it's all about us, and then if you think about law school education too, you know, we've got to work by ourselves because that's the grade that we get, then we get to get the #1 rank, so we get the journal, we get the clerkships, so they're never wanting to collaborate. Now, in the business world, however, and remember your clients, right? The people who hire you, who pay your billable hours, now are demanding that they collaborate because they get a better work product. And it's now that we see the movement towards collaboration in legal education, right? So it's going to take, I mean, it takes time, and we've got to look at different ways that we can actually move the needle to speed up that change. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you.
So I was interested in your point about helping students feel empowered by covering social justice issues. In some of the cases I cover, the role of race isn't that someone was able to affect change, but that racism kept the right side from winning. Do you have any advice about how to cover those types of cases, and they're, you know, it's ubiquitous, without making students feel disempowered by the way the case actually came out?
You know what? And I do sometimes feel like, oh my goodness, and we start by going, really? But it's our job to come to let them know that, you know, here's the law, and it's all an interpretation of the law. And this is why we need good lawyers. Because the judges are going to decide based on the information that's in front of them. Of course, there's bias, but we also know, based on precedent as well, that they have got to give you a reason, right, for their decision, right? So if we're going in with the briefs, so we've got to make sure that those briefs are properly written, right? We've done our research and we've supported it. And if we support, we've got to support our assertion in a way that we direct the judges to the decision that we want them, so they have the support there. They're not just, you know, so again, they're supporting it, so they're going by precedent, and then we also, if there's something and there's change, then, you know, we find some support for that, so we influence that change, right? And that's, you know, that's the best that we can actually do. We have to make sure that we are prepared as lawyers.
I appreciate how problem design can be a way of trying to incorporate these things into the curriculum. I'm wondering if you have suggestions or things that you've found to be effective in terms of smaller moments of incorporating these ideas into either the legal writing curriculum or sort of maybe more generally across, especially the 1L curriculum, where students don't have as much choice
Probably even, for example, legal writing, a client letter, which is just discreet if you do client letters. If you say, and that's short, help the student to get reinstated into school, or let's talk about this person who's being evicted, what can we do? That is enough to even just set off the light bulbs and just say, this is what, here, these folks are facing this issue, and how do we help them fix it? That's good. Did I say another hand?
I was wondering what you think about how these issues would interact with a legal writing class if it's a letter grade. Like, would that be better? Or, I'm sort of loath to want more graded classes, but it seems like a very practical class, and it's one that's not graded, and that doesn't make a ton of sense to me.
And the legal writing is not graded?
Oh, yeah, sorry, it's not graded here anyway. I don't know how common that is, but.
Okay, so, or legal writing course is graded. But when you think about this, as a law student, and you go into practice, they're judging you by your writing. So it behooves you and your classmates to actually focus on your writing, right? Which actually also means, however, so if you have a set of students who feel excluded or feel that they cannot write, think about how unlevel that playing field is going to be for them if they're not motivated to write, if they're not motivated to participate in that class, because that's a critical class. A partner will tell you, I could teach you securities law, I could teach you torts, I can teach you contracts, but I cannot teach you how to write. I don't have the time. Right? So again, even if the class is not graded, as a student, you're probably thinking and making the connection, and if you're motivated, if you're excited about working on these problems, will help you to become a better writer. I find that with my students. They're so excited when they think that, oh my goodness, for the people who are representing the police officers, and I thought, you're representing the police. Oh yeah, they want these police officers because, I should have done the work and it's not the police officer's fault. And for the other side, Mr. Duvall, who represent Dr. Duvall, they should have done this and the officer should have just released it immediately, and they're so excited. And so they're in there and they're trying to work, and it really just creates a better product.
One trend that I've noticed over the past semester and a half, almost 2 semesters now, is that there's this default assumption that everybody is going to go into corporate law after graduation, and that for our law school at least is very much not true. Like statistically speaking, between 60 and 70% go into private law right after graduation, so like statistically inaccurate assumption. And that seems to me to be connected to some of the social justice issues and diversity issues that link into the culture that shapes 1L. I don't know if you have any thoughts on how to go about addressing that underlying assumption among faculty members, or how to, if there's a reminder needed somewhere that the legal field is a diverse place and not everybody is going to be working in a very rigid, firm hierarchy. I don't know if that's something that you have any thoughts on.
I guess, yeah, and it's the culture actually. So, when you watch television most times, when they talk about, the lawyers, they're practicing and they're from a firm or something of that nature. And we think about, we're going to a firm and, lots of students think that's, because some students who come into law school actually, and you're actually right, who come into law school and do not necessarily know about all the options. They think the firm is the only option. and it's because of the messaging and the branding. Then, as a member, then probably if you want to be in the public interest society, then just be in the public interest and brand it that way. This is where we're going and the work that we've been doing, and so you start rebranding, you start sending the message that there is the other, because I'm sure other students want to be there, right? This is where they really want to be, and then I guess, for collecting purposes, sometimes the school wants to say, we are the top, or we're in the top 10 for sending our students to large firms. But also, what is the other part? Well, we should also be in the top 10 for sending our students into public interest spaces as well, right? So I think it's starting with the messaging, and when the students get into good public interest or do good public interest work, social justice work, then put that out there, brand it, make it known, and make it a celebrating point for the school. And then, yes.
When you bring these social justice issues into the legal writing classroom, do you have incidents where some students take that opportunity to say problematic things? And how do you handle that?
I do. And I've had discussions as well where students feel a particular way because, they were raised a particular way. This is, my family's belief. I can't think about it. I had, was it last year we did a transgender issue, and the student had a real problem with that because, and so we had the conversation, and I said, so think about it, because or a transgender person was clear, and I said, okay, so for example, you spent all your life preparing to be a lawyer, right? I said, you got great grades, you're at the top of everything, there's this job, and it's so suited to you, and this is all that you can dream of, this particular job, right? And she's like, yes. And I'm like, you got the interview, they want you to come in, you nail this, you've got this job, right? It's yours. And you walk in and they see you, and they decide not to give it to you because of who you are. How would you feel? And she hadn't thought about it from that angle. She really had not thought about it from that angle. And as a matter of fact, because we also blindly assign them, for democratic process, I just split the attendance sheet down the middle and assign one side to the plaintiff and the other side to the defendant. And, it's either my research assistant or somebody who walks into the office will toss the coin, and this side will probably go to the plaintiff. So it's transparent. And she had to advocate for Blair, and she did a good job, because now she's thinking about Blair as somebody like me, right? Now we could say the Phoenix Challenge. And it's just about, if you change the rhetoric and if you change the mindset, we are all made up of the same thing. We all have blood flowing through our veins. And clearly, we may look differently, but we may have the same type of blood. And so if we actually see each other from that space, it makes it so much easier.
Yeah, so I think something that's a recurring instance in our super sections is we're taking a class, we're reading the case, and a professor or a student says something that is just extremely problematic, and then the 4 black students in the super section look at each other like, who's going to take this one? And I think the problem is, after that, usually there's maybe a conversation with the professor or some follow-up that ensues, and I'm just curious, and I think something that I'm missing by not being a student at Howard Law is the pre-assumption that these things matter to some extent and they should be incorporated. So I'm just curious if, like, behind scenes with other faculty members or people that you speak with, professors have developed strategies for addressing this and have found a way to effectively communicate with students and then move forward with concrete solutions to ensure that classes in the future are more effectively addressing these issues for students of color.
Yes, and I understand how, as a student sitting there, it's annoying, right? And it just stops you in the tracks, it's annoying. I think one of the things as well is, and you're doing the right thing by addressing it with your professors and raising it with the professors, and somewhat building again a solid coping mechanism, a perception of control, this person is probably off the chain. And then one of the things that you can actually ask the professor to do, can you actually, at some point, or make, there's a particular issue that, do a tiny presentation on that issue, because that person who actually raised that concern is oftentimes probably very ignorant. And if they're trying to be annoying, then, that's just way too bad. At least the rest of the class needs to be educated on that particular issue. And hopefully, where there's unity number, they'll come back and they'll say to that person, you're just acting really crazy. What's wrong with you? Right? And they'll see it's not a joke, because sometimes they do it just to annoy, just to get a kick, and just to see a reaction. Like, really? Are we past that?
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Oh, okay, so I was gonna ask, at a school with like a predominantly white faculty, who's in the best position for legal practice specifically to be drafting those typos or scenarios for briefs or memos? Like, should former students of color get input on that, or who shoulders that decision?
Your professors are qualified to do that. I think when you go into practice, for example, and you're asked to take on a case, they're assigning the case to you. They're not thinking about your diversity background. They're not thinking, okay, I'm just going to give black issues to black person, or women issues to women, right? And so they're thinking, who's the best person for the job? And once you've actually done the research, you can actually design a problem. And there are lots and lots and lots of resources out there as well. And you've got to also trust your professor, that your professor has the best interest at heart in teaching that problem. And if they make a mistake, because we all do, we don't know everything, then you may actually, like the gentleman said, let me go later and let me talk to my professor about this particular issue. Let me just say, well, you know what, when you said about this particular person, or like a Rastafarianism, when you say a Rastafarian, eats, pork, that's not correct. Because that's probably something that, your research, when you're doing the research to design a problem, you're not picking up, right? Something that you know. So if you have that knowledge, it's okay to tell the professor, and that professor adds that to the memory bank and just makes it smoother for the other students that come after. Thank you so very much.